I would say there are three key points within video game development. There are the features, so the gameplay mechanics, is single player or also has a multiplayer, the graphics, so if it includes ray tracing and highly detailed 3D models, or is it just a 2D pixel art game, and the optimization, the file size of the game, and how well it runs on various different hardware, if it runs on old hardware or requires newer hardware. And you can't have all three. You can't have a game that has a ton of features, a ton of modes, while also having a game that looks visually amazing, it has ray tracing, and also is very optimized like on all hardware. You cannot have all three. At most you can have two, but one has to be sacrificed, or you make sacrifices on all three to get a more well-balanced game. To go into further detail, gameplay feature mechanics, that's including like driving in an open world game like in Grand Theft Auto, or flying in a game like that as well, adding features like a grappling hook, or shooting, modes such as that, all the different sports mode you see in Grand Theft Auto as well, like you can play tennis or basketball, the general length of the game, how much content is within, like a 10-hour playthrough of a single player game, amount of unique models and textures used, so if there's a lot of unique assets, or do they reuse a lot of assets, game modes, so single player, multiplayer, co-op, and procedural generation, which can help reduce the size of the game and make more repeatable content or replayable. The graphics, like I said, it could be a 2D or 3D game, physically based rendering, so that is a texture that has multiple layers, so a normal bump map, so that can make the way the object might reflect light or look 3D. This takes up more memory. The animation details, so a game that has maybe mocap animations for characters rather than ones that are programmed in or even procedurally done. The sound quality, so footstep sounds or the music, the other atmospheric elements can happen, and the new ray tracing or path tracing, that is a nice realistic lighting method. Lastly, optimization, like I said, file size of the game, it's targeted FPS, so is it going for 60 or 30? Hardware requirements, are we looking to play on the tiny little Raspberry Pi, or are we just looking to focus on the latest tech? Cross-platform could be Mac OS, Linux and Windows, or also beyond with the Switch, PlayStation and Xbox. And also how common bugs appear, how well have they gone through to make the game, make sure that it is bug free, you can play through without noticing any real issues, and you can't get soft locked. So why bring this up? Well, the new Call of Duty was announced at Xbox Showcase, and there was this kind of rumor going around that the game was huge, it was going to be 300 gigabytes, it wasn't, and a lot of people were saying, hey, please compress your games. It wasn't actually 300 gigabytes, it was somewhere around 100, I believe. It was just that if you installed all games, so Warzone, the current Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 3, and then the new one that's coming, it would be 305 gigabytes. Either way, the reason I want to talk about it is because you can't just simply compress these games, and in fact, some form of compression is in fact probably used in a lot of methods. So if we look at the modern Call of Duty, so anything that was kind of released in 2019 and beyond, you'll notice that they have a lot of features, look amazing, but the kind of optimization you could say is not as good as you might want. You can't really run this game on older hardware, it will struggle, and it has a lot of features that are great for new hardware, DLSS, ray tracing elements that are only compatible on the latest hardware that supports it. Those features, you have single player, multiplayer, you even have PvE elements, so you have the zombies mode that they introduce. You've got the whole Warzone, which is the Battle Royale, which is in itself kind of a separate game. So whether you include that or not, it's up to you. And obviously the graphics are just kind of something. It features ray tracing mode. It has very detailed animation and mocap animations as well. So you have this game that's obviously going to be very large. And I'm not sure how much real evidence there is that there is compression is used. It depends what you define as compression. You could have a PNG image for all the textures, right? That's a form of lossless compression. But you could have JPEG, which is a lossy compression. So JPEG is significantly smaller, but you take a chunk of how good it looks. And in a game like Cold War, when that came out, there was an option to have like these lower resolution textures. But what ended up happening was you had these nice, highly detailed models, and then you slapped on this kind of blurry texture. Like it didn't come out. It took away from the style of the game, and it kind of looked a bit jarring. So you have to make some sacrifices for it. You know, you want this nice, beautiful looking Call of Duty, these detailed animations to make it feel more realistic. You can't do that and have the game to be a much smaller size. Sacrifices have to be made, like reusing a lot of textures and assets and so forth. We take a look at the other side, you know, another Microsoft game, which is Minecraft. That is a game that is not focused on graphics at all and is focused on the features and optimization. Significant heavy focus on optimization, as you know, it's the updates take about a year, and some people say they lack content compared to modding. And that's really because they've got to make sure it runs on every platform. This game has two versions, the Bedrock and Java, so they both need to be updated. Bedrock needs to run on Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, and PC, and smartphones. You have a wide range, and they all need to run nice and smoothly and well optimized, which is very challenging. The textures and just the whole world is, not very detailed. It's a simple blocks. The textures are only default textures are 16 by 16 pixels, tiny compared to when you look at Call of Duty with the 4K. And it's an open sandbox of endless content. So you have this game that has a ton of features, ton of things you can do. You can spend many hours, and technically endless content. There's no end real. You can keep going, while also running on a lot of hardware of a wide range, still using OpenGL, so you can run on old hardware as well. But you can really switch it around with Minecraft RTX that was introduced, and this takes it to graphics and not in favor of optimization. You have this game that looks visually amazing, nice ray tracing, real good ray tracing as well, but you just eat away at the optimization. It only runs on certain hardware, exclusive to Windows, so there's no Linux port because it requires DirectX, which does not run on Linux, and does not run on Java. Java has no support, so you've completely significantly reduced the pool of which players can play. You need to have an RTX based card or one of the later AMD cards to actually use it. So you see how the change. You got this nice visually amazing game, but now you've limited it to a certain pool of people. Now, what about a game that has good graphics but also good optimization? I'd say something like Metroid Prime series, particularly first one, that you got these rooms that are relatively small, but a game that looks visually amazing, while also aiming for 60 FPS, which it does really well. This is a game that was released on the GameCube as well to look back on. And while the game was actually kind of long, it'll take you about 8 hours to go through, I'd say, your first playthrough, maybe around then. But it has a lot of, if you look at it, you notice there's things that they do to make it run at 60 FPS. So the long corridors and winding tunnels that you go through, which is used to allow them to load the next room. The way the game works is that as you approach the room, it then loads it into memory. And when you open that door, it then should hopefully be ready. There are actually some elements in the game which the loading takes a significant long time. You actually sit behind a door waiting for it. So this is an interesting mix here, as opposed to having less graphics and large features. So you could have a very huge room or very quick load times. And what about a game that kind of takes a share of a bit of both? So I think Elden Ring is a game that is less focused on graphics and a heavy focus on features, and a bit more in the optimization, but not entirely. So Elden Ring is a humongous game. It's a huge open world game. It takes a long time. You could easily spend 100 hours going through the game to complete it. That's how long it takes. It did have performance issues at launch, which was stuttering. I remember that on PC. It was not as photorealistic as other games, and it used a lot of assets from its old Dark Souls games, including sound effects, animations, just those kind of things. The UI elements as well, which were not the best visually looking, but the hardware requirements, they weren't too bad. The game was still large, but so you had this game that had incorporated many features, didn't focus on graphics, and focus on a relative bit of optimization. And this could have been just purely really accidental. They wanted to focus on a game that had a lot of features. They just reused the assets they had, and they didn't think about, we want this to run on many platforms. It was just, that's how it was. That could have been entirely the reasons of it. I would say that this is more apparent in older games at 3 points, and that's just because of factors like the limited hardware. But one big one is the RAM, the amount of available memory. The Xbox 360 had 512 megabytes RAM. You go onto the Xbox One, you've got 8 gigabytes, and that opens the door to having these super juicy high-res textures that take up a lot of hard drive space. So that's one of the optimization sacrifices that are made. This is why these big games get so big. In fact, I did a whole video on why video games are getting so large, and one of them is the RAM. The RAM has opened that door to these huge games, and more sacrifices are made. You can see that in a lot of visuals or gameplay mechanics that are kind of toned down to show it. Another one is limited storage space. You had the cartridge or disc, and so you couldn't fit a ton of stuff in. You had to find a way to fit it in, depending on how big your game is. And so if we look at like Ocarina of Time, this was a game that focused heavily on features and the graphics. So it was a visually good game for the N64 at the time, and it had a lot of features. It had this open world, in-depth story. There was many different elements. You had side quests you could do, and you had this whole time travel thing. You could swap between a kid and another adult, and that completely affected the way the world looks. But the game ran at 20 FPS visually. It was very weird because the inputs were recorded in 60 FPS, but the game visually ran at 20 FPS, which is very, very interesting. On the other end of an N64 game, Fzero-x was specifically targeted at 60 FPS, and so they had to make sacrifices. One of them was the visual world. The textures are much more flat. They're basically block colors, and that's really it, and some shiny reflectiveness on it. And then you had these little racetracks. They're supposed to get it to run at 60 FPS. They even incorporated procedural generation in one of the cups where the level was randomly generated, and you had different modes. You could consider it to be less features as well. I wasn't sure if it was a game with high features or less features, kind of hard to gauge, but they did have a lot of different machines, different modes. So I think it was, a game that did have a lot of features and was also very well optimized in terms that it was targeting 60 FPS. And here's just, a visual comparison. You can see in Ocarina of Time, you had this UI, all these elements, the health bar, and you had this detailed world. You had trees, you had the background, you had the sky, you had the mountains in the back. While on Fzero-x, you just have a very flat looking, basic textured world, the racetrack and a skybox. That was really it, and then the enemies around you, and then the UI elements in order to target at 60 FPS effectively. Otherwise, you had an unsatisfying playing experience because of how fast the machines were going. 60 FPS were required, really. That was what they intended. It's possible to play on all three. That commonly happens with asset flip games. So these are games where people just download the assets from like the Unreal Store, Unity Store, or areas like that, and they've put them in together and tried to make a game out of it, and they've done no optimizations, no real thought into it, until you get a game that doesn't really look good, it runs terribly, and is actually lacking in features because it's so rushed. They have no clue what they're doing. They're just quickly there to make a quick buck, essentially. So bad ports is another one. So Mortal Kombat 1, let's see if I move my head out of the way a bit better. There we go. It has this terrible looking Johnny Cage, and that's Johnny Cage on the left. Look on the Switch version, just his eyes don't have any animations. His hands is all janky. If you look at the thing, it is not good. Not only that, the game didn't even run well. So you had this less features because you had less simpler animations. You had worse graphics because they had to tone it down. They couldn't have all these highly detailed clothing details. You can see that in the image. Johnny Cage's t-shirt or shirt here, it doesn't have all the features. It's just a flat color basically. And so you had this game that didn't run well, had less features because it had less animations and such, and wasn't as optimized, and didn't look as good. So yeah, other is just rushed game development. You're running out of time, and you couldn't implement all the features. That can result in a game that just doesn't look good, doesn't have many features, or is not well optimized. Lack of game direction as well. So it's a certain style, so that can correlates with poor game design. If you having a certain visual style and it conflicts with your features and your optimization, your photos, you got a lot of features and all that. So general poor direction can result in just failing at all 3 points. And I think one more factor to go over is budget is important. We look at those 3 points, and actually you can't even do them if you don't have the money required. If it's expensive to do photos and ray tracing, that is not an easy thing to do. It's easy to do procedural generation, so that's a real fun thing to do with indie development, because it means you can make a lot of features and content without having to manually handcraft it, and that can help improve optimization as well. In fact, that's a kind of a middle ground. It can be bad for optimization or good. It can be good for, like, if you preload it, then that's saves on optimization. But you're loading, rendering it on the go, that's that eats in that performance. Easier to do pixel art as well. 2D is much easier than 3D. You're only having to deal with 2 points, X and Y, as opposed to 3D. You're now dealing with X and Y, Z vertices. A lot harder to do collision, and this is why indies kind of really like to do those. Mocap animation as well, like we've seen Call of Duty. They're very cool, very detailed, but you need a whole studio to do that, and that's again an expensive thing. The voice acting is also just in general expensive, especially get it from professionals or very well respected voice actors or actresses. And time. The longer you take to develop a game, the more money it costs, and the less profit you make. Because if you look at it in terms of you sold a game, you sold certain economies, you then calculate what was my year on hour averagely earning. So the longer you take, that reduces the hour averagely earning, which all of these affect those 3 points. You may have a game that has, if you're building a smaller game, you're going to have less features, less graphics, and there may be a more focus on photorealism to reach to a wider audience. And in really conclusion, just go make games. It's not actually a thing you really need to worry about, especially on an indie developer scale. You're doing 2D pixel art using a modern game engine. CPUs and GPUs are just so fast nowadays, and the engine just kind of handle itself, that there's not actually really a thing you need to worry about. You don't really need to think into depth that I need to cut down on features in order to make the game run faster or make the game look a bit better, because those kind of games are just, are not taxing anymore. We're not on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System days anymore. Modern hardware is capable of doing all sorts of fancy things, and it's more of a concern with big AAA devs that are doing these photorealistic, highly detailed, expansive games. But subconsciously, you probably are thinking about it, and you are probably making different methods to optimize your game. So if you're doing those Vampire Slayer games where you have a ton of entities on screen, you are then thinking more about optimization, where you can't be checking collision on every single entity that appears on the screen, and methods need to be made to improve it so it does just run on better on hardware. So I'll see you in more videos, and just go out there, make games, do stuff. See you.